But I think my real interest is not so much, shifting time for the sake of it. My real interest is points of view, deciding what's the point of view we're trying to express in the story, whose eyes are we seeing the story through. And in the case of Memento, it was very specifically, the structure is very specifically an attempt to see the events of the story through Leonard's eyes, basically.
My brother told me the story verbally before he'd finished writing it, and the screenplay is an extrapolation of his basic idea, which I was fascinated by. And he told it to me while we were driving cross-country between Chicago and Los Angeles. And we both decided right away that by far the most interesting way of approaching that concept was subjectively, to tell the story in the first person. So he went off to write his short story. I went off to write the screenplay. I would describe Memento as a psychological thriller centered around the idea of a man with no short-term memory. And the idea of the film is through an interesting structural conceit, essentially telling the story backwards. We're attempting to put the audience into the head of this character with a very peculiar perceptual distortion, a very unusual way of looking at the world. And that's the kind of thing I'm very interested in films, particularly in thrillers, is taking a very unusual point of view and really putting the audience into that mindset.
It's different from conventional amnesia, if you like, or the usual form of amnesia that you see in films or whatever, in that he knows everything about himself. He knows all the objective information his long-term memory provides him with, what his name is, where he was born, where he grew up, who he was married to, all this stuff. But at some point a few years before, he's lost the ability to make new memories.
What's the last thing that you do remember?
My wife.
That's sweet.
Dying.
And my solution to telling the story subjectively was to deny the audience the same information that the protagonist is denied. And my approach to doing that was to effectively tell the story backwards. That way, when we meet a character, we don't know, just like the protagonist, how he's met that person, whether he's even met that person before, or whether or not they should be trusted, that kind of thing. So the story is basically told backwards. It's basically told as a series of flashbacks that go further and further back in time. So what I did is I alternated between these color sequences that are intensely subjective. Everything in the color sequences is from Leonard's point of view. We're always in his head, at least to begin with. We alternate with these black and white sequences that, at least to begin with, are objective. The voiceovers in the color sequence and the black and white sequence are very different. In the color sequence, it's the voice of the mind. It's the first person. It's very much his thoughts as he's thinking them. In the black and white scenes, they sound a bit like interview grabs. A bit like this kind of interview, edited and laid over pictures of him in this room going about his life. So I wanted to introduce this almost documentary style element at the beginning of the film, to give the audience a little bit of information, objective information about how this guy lives his life and what he thinks.
What's it like? It's like waking. It's like you just woke up.
What's the best way to draw it? The best way to draw it is as a hairpin, like that. That's basically the end of the movie. This stuff is the black and white stuff. This is color. And this is running backwards as a series of jumps. And what we do is we cut between the two the whole way through. So we alternate scene here, scene there, scene there, scene there, scene there, scene there, and they meet towards the end of the film. But then within this, you have flashbacks to a different timeline, which is actually even earlier, somewhere around there. The way in which we cut between these two things is we'll take a color scene, and then we'll cut to a black and white scene that's shorter in length. And then we come back to the color scene, and we basically, as these are going essentially backwards in time, we're sort of leapfrogging, and we wind up repeating the beginning of a scene at the end of another scene, and vice versa. And in that way, we use repetitions of certain parts of scenes to clue the audience into where they are chronologically. So essentially what we're always doing is we're beginning every scene with something of a cliffhanger, something of an unusual situation or a memorable image. And then in a later scene, we're explaining how that situation has been arrived at. And that's the rhythm of the film over the entire course of the movie. So it's in a way taking a familiar cinematic rhythm, you know, the rhythm of the cliffhanger or the question and then the answer. And it's presenting that as an alternating rhythm the whole way through the film. It's the context of a scene. It's the context within which a particular action happens. Like him, there's a point at which he's searching for a pen and he's trying to write something down and remember something and all the rest. And we see that once and we don't really understand it. And we see it again, it has a rather different meaning. So those repetitions start to take on a more substantial role, I think, in the narrative, other than just orienting us, you know, in time. They actually start to suggest the way in which the narrative context in which a particular action happens is changing what that action represents.
And in repeating things throughout the story, I think you start to get that sense of how his life is this kind of endless series of similar interludes. And very much, you know, he's constantly in the state of, as he describes in the film, like he just woke up, you know, like it is a dream, he's just woken up. They didn't write anything before coming up with that approach to the story, and to me the structure and the story are one and the same. They are totally inseparable. Can you reorder the film and view it in a chronological sense? And my answer is you can. Logically it holds up, but it's a completely different story. I mean, it's the narrative is entirely different. Your perception of the character is entirely different. And to me that was very important, and that's why I wrote the script the way it appears on screen. I think I was just so excited by the whole process, though, that I found it easier than I should have. You know, I just kind of got through it, and then once I had it on the page, I would go back and check the particular logic. It was very difficult to rewrite. The writing wasn't so tough, but with that structure, anytime you change anything in a scene, there are all kinds of ramifications in both directions in the script. So it's a very complex rewrite process you go through on a script like that.
So you lie to yourself to be happy. There's nothing wrong with that. We all do it. Who cares if there's a few little details you'd rather not remember?
As the film progresses, the color sequences become a little bit less intensely subjective. I think towards the end of the film, we really start to step outside his head a little bit and start to question some of the things we've been told about this character, or some of the things he's told us himself. The black and white scenes, on the other hand, as the movie progresses, they become less and less objective. We start to get more and more into his head as he exists in this motel room. And in fact, then the black and white and the color scenes actually meet towards the end of the movie. And I think these two perspectives, the objective and the subjective, the backwards running narrative and the forwards running narrative, they actually meet at what is the end of the movie. And I think the way that we try and focus on this end of the film and making that as extreme as possible is by taking this subjective view and this objective view and effectively having them meet at the end, so that what we achieve is still subjective, but with enough objective information built into it that we start to question the point of view that we've been given for the whole film. The other thing we wind up doing in the end, in terms of the way in which we mix images and reinterpret images, is to suggest the complex relationship between imagination and memory. And we see him towards the end. We present certain images that we've seen from his past life within a different context. And in a different context, they have a slightly different meaning. And I think the suggestion there is that he, like all of us, is able to manipulate the meanings of certain memories, or manipulate his own interpretations of certain memories according to his present circumstance. The interesting thing about the ending to me is that some people think it is crystal clear. Most people think it's confusing and ambiguous and a little bit frustrating. As far as I'm concerned, the way the ending is intended to work is that, for me, the film is all about his subjective view of the world and his inability to perceive any kind of objective truth beyond that. And for me, that's kind of interesting, because I think that's how we all go through everyday life. And I didn't want to depart too far from that at the end of the movie. I didn't want to betray those terms. So the end of the film offers alternatives, it offers ambiguities. And the audience, I think, is very much put in the position of Leonard in terms of having to choose what they want to believe. And for us, that was sort of essential, because I'm very interested by the fact that we don't have that in everyday life, and we go to films to find that, to find this comfortable universe where the subjective truth is always specified at the end. There's plenty of exposition at the end of the film, but the terms of the film make you question it in a way that you don't at the end of most films. And for me, that's very interesting.
Look, memory can change the shape of a room, it can change the color of a car. And memories can be distorted. They're just an interpretation, they're not a record. And they're irrelevant if you have the facts.
Ultimately, the film is really just an extrapolation of the way I live my life. You know, I write notes on my hands, I take pictures of things, I have objects around, you know, in my apartment to remind me of things, you know, this sort of thing. So the script really is just an exaggeration of this. And I felt that was very important to maintain, because to me what makes the film interesting is that it is an exaggeration, an extrapolation of all of our lives. It's not a freak show. You know, this is not a freakish character. This is actually an everyman. This is one of us. He's a vehicle for making us think about our place in the world and how we identify ourselves in a slightly different way.
And I was fascinated by this idea of somebody who's struggling to reconcile their present self, you know, who they wake up and find looking back at themselves in the mirror, trying to reconcile that with all the information he knows about himself from his long-term memory. Once you start to examine the specifics of how interpretive your short-term memory is, rather than, you know, it's not a tape recorder, you know, as he says in the film, it is an interpretation, not a record. Because we all proceed under this very confident assumption every day that we are accurately perceiving the world around us and filing this away as accurate information, and we tend to ignore the interpretive nature of that. To me, what the film is fascinated by is the tension between our imprisonment in our own subjective view of the world and our unshakable faith that there is an objective reality outside of that. I quite like films where you know where you're going, and the process of the narrative is not so much what happens next as why has this thing happened. That to me becomes very interesting. But I think my real interest is not so much, you know, shifting time for the sake of it. My real interest is points of view, you know, deciding what's the point of view we're trying to express in the story, whose eyes are we seeing the story through. And in the case of Memento, you know, it was very specifically the structure is very specifically an attempt to see the events of the story through Leonard's eyes, basically.
Now, where was I?
Christopher Nolan is known for his high-concept thrillers, and if you want to write movies like him, you have to be a master at story structure. If you want to learn how, I highly recommend my friend Tyler Mowry's YouTube channel. There, he talks about story structure among other fundamental elements of screenwriting. I'll leave the link in the description. Once again, thank you guys for watching. I will see you guys next week as we take another look behind the curtain.